This video was made possible by Tab for a Cause. Raise money for charity just by opening new tabs, which we were going to do anyway. The coronavirus is an all-out pandemic. We're close to reaching levels of almost 100,000 new infections per day. But obviously, somebody has to be at fault, right? Some have blamed President Trump. President Trump has blamed China. And Fox News can't decide who it wants to blame. But at least we can all agree that this is Florida's fault. But of course, there are a lot of people suffering in significant ways and many dying as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. And that leaves many wondering, who is liable for this whole mess? And more importantly, can I sue them? So by popular demand, and I got a lot of requests for this, today we're gonna cover whether you can sue China, whether you can sue President Trump, or Fox News over handling the coronavirus crisis. Hey Legal Eagles, it's time to think like a lawyer because the coronavirus is in the US, and as Americans, when there's a problem, we file suit.
Judgment, I'll sue.
But in the court of law, the question still remains, who, if anyone, can be legally held accountable for the damages suffered from the coronavirus? I mean, this is America. There has to be someone that we can sue over this coronavirus, right? Well, let's take a look at a few of the big players when it comes to who may be responsible for the size and magnitude of the current coronavirus pandemic. So first, can we sue China? Blame certainly just doesn't lie with one person or even one country for that matter, but for those affected by COVID-19, one might first look to where it all originated. China. It was first discovered in Wuhan, China, where the coronavirus first appeared as this mysterious pneumonia that began with just a few infections of a few patients. And it was China where, despite having an alleged first-class infectious disease reporting system in place, they completely failed to contain the spread of the virus because of local health officials' fear of providing bad news to the central health authorities for the Republic of China. It could certainly be argued that but for China's failure to take the proper proactive measures, this virus could have been largely contained, and many, if not most, would not have had to suffer for the impact of the virus. So that is the argument, and whether you believe that argument or not, I will leave that up to you, but it does raise the question, if there is any veracity to it, could someone who becomes sick with the coronavirus have a legitimate legal claim against China? We don't often hear about individuals suing another foreign government, and there's a very good reason for that. There's one hurdle that's almost impossible to overcome under the current circumstances, and that hurdle is known as the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, which was passed in 1976 to protect foreign sovereigns from the burdens and costs of litigation. You can't really sue foreign governments. Now, despite the alleged mishandling of the coronavirus outbreak and the lack of transparency and presumably the ensuing damages that resulted from the government of China's actions, any attempt to sue them would be completely in vain. The Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act states that, quote, a foreign state shall be immune from the jurisdiction of the courts of the United States and of the states. The force and scope of the immunity is pretty daunting. For instance, when the family of a child who was killed by an allegedly malfunctioning hunting rifle sued the manufacturer of the rifle, which was actually owned by the Chinese government, the defendant didn't even bother to file a response to the complaint. Instead, the company just sent the complaint back to the plaintiff, and the court ultimately held that the company was immune under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. Now, on its face, this law might seem unfair, but there's a legitimate purpose behind the broad sovereign immunity right. It's essentially an act of reciprocity in ensuring that the United States will not be sued in other countries as well. Now, there are exceptions to this immunity, but they're incredibly limited. There are some carve-outs regarding terrorist acts like what we've seen with Iran and Libya, for example. And there is an exception if a foreign state actually waives its immunity or if the lawsuit is based upon a commercial activity. But here, the only potentially relevant exception would be if damages were, quote, caused by the tortious act or omission of that foreign state or of any official or employee of that foreign state while acting within the scope of his office or employment. Now, this sounds like it might be a plausible exception, except for the fact that the section specifically bars any claim, quote, based upon the exercise or performance or the failure to exercise or perform a discretionary function regardless of whether the discretion be abused. Now, based on the information we currently have, it's not clear how any lawsuit stemming from the coronavirus pandemic could find a plausible way to get into one of these exceptions and overcome the immunity that almost all governments have. But you don't know until you try, I suppose, and that's exactly what an attorney by the name of Matthew Moore out of Boca Raton is attempting to do right now. Just recently, a class action lawsuit has been filed against the People's Republic of China among other parties, for damages that have resulted from the global pandemic. The central allegation of the complaint is that the, quote, PRC and the other defendants knew that COVID-19 was dangerous and capable of causing a pandemic, yet slowly acted, proverbially put their heads in the sand, and/or covered it up for their own economic self-interest. The lawsuit then goes on to allege injury, damage, and loss related to the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus, including discernible physical manifestations and injuries of trauma from the negligent conduct, including but not limited to physical pains, headaches, anxiety, and insomnia. The plaintiffs are arguing that the lawsuit falls under the exceptions to the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act as a commercial activity, and because of the tortious harm or death that resulted from the Chinese government's negligence in handling the coronavirus outbreak. Now, ironically, none of the initial plaintiffs have actually contracted the coronavirus itself, which leads to all kinds of standing issues, but on top of that, what they're effectively alleging is that the Chinese government didn't handle the situation as well as it should have. But you can't sue foreign governments just because you wish they would have done something different. That's exactly what sovereigns do. They govern, and you don't get to sue governments over mishandling of things in their core function. This lawsuit is definitely going to get dismissed, and barring any new information, almost all of the lawsuits in a similar vein are going to be dismissed as well. But that's the Chinese government. It's all the way across the Pacific. What about a government closer to home? What about suing President Trump himself?
I don't take responsibility at all.
What about suing him for how he has handled the coronavirus response?
When you say me, I didn't do it.
The argument is that President Trump has told people to go back to work while being sick, stated that the virus would go away miraculously, and even gave Americans false hope by claiming that we were on the brink of having a vaccine available and that tests would be plentiful and available to anyone that wanted them.
Anybody right now and yesterday, anybody that needs a test gets a test. They're there. They have the tests. And the tests are beautiful. Anybody that needs a test gets a test.
And there are reports that the president resisted widespread testing to keep the number of infections artificially low.
I like the numbers being where they are.
And if that's not enough, let's take a very specific recent example where President Trump took to Twitter to promote two anti-malaria drugs, chloroquine and its derivative hydroxychloroquine, as miracle cures for COVID-19. And while there may be some potential benefit from these drugs, the manner in which the president has presented these drugs, which is based on incredibly preliminary information, led some to believe that you could take the drugs as a prophylactic against the virus itself. Such was the case for an Arizona couple that heard the president's report and realized they had some fish tank cleaner that contained the so-called miracle drug. And because of their reliance on President Trump, they both decided to ingest the fish tank cleaner, and as a result, the wife was hospitalized while the husband actually died. Now, I'm sure most people wouldn't think to ingest fish tank cleaner, let alone take it prophylactically against a virus that is not actually fatal for most people that contract it. But the point is, there was an allegedly misleading, if not outright false statement made by the president.
It's not like a brand new drug that's been just created that may have an unbelievable monumental effect, like kill you.
People relied on those statements, and as a direct result of that reliance, individuals were injured and one actually died. Slam dunk case, right? Well, not so fast, because just as foreign governments have immunity from suit, so too do domestic governments, and in particular, the president. In the Supreme Court case of Nixon versus Fitzgerald, a contractor sued the president, among others, for the loss of his position within the US Air Force. But the Supreme Court held in a 5-4 decision that the president is entitled to absolute immunity from liability for civil damages based on his official acts. The court made clear distinctions on presidential liability, noting that presidents could still be charged criminally for official acts. In addition, unofficial acts of presidents were also fair play. This distinction between official and unofficial acts was solidified in the famous lawsuit by Paula Jones against then-President Clinton for alleged sexual harassment committed while he was governor of Arkansas. The Supreme Court held that there was no justifiable reason, including separation of powers, that would prohibit federal courts from hearing Jones's sexual harassment suit, since it did not have to do with any official acts made by President Clinton while in office. Justice Stevens, who wrote the majority opinion, reasoned that the litigation of questions that relate entirely to unofficial conduct of the individual who happens to be the president poses no perceptible risk of misallocation of either judicial power or executive power. But where a suit involves the official acts of the president in his capacity as president, then the president would be immune from suit. Now, the argument for giving the president immunity for official acts is twofold. First, the Supreme Court noted in Clinton versus Jones, the president needs immunity for official acts so he can, quote, perform designated functions effectively without fear. The second justification for this immunity lies in the fact that there are sufficient checks and balances on the president that most others, including other executive officials, don't have to face. In addition to increased scrutiny a president faces from the media and a desire for re-election, Congress can oversee the president's actions in a variety of ways, including the power of impeachment, at least in theory. Many have argued that the president has misled the American people and has mismanaged the coronavirus pandemic.
You know, a lot of people think that goes away in April with the heat, as the heat comes in. Typically that will go away in April. We're in great shape though.
And that as a result of those actions, it should be at least be considered negligence. But it would be impossible to argue that any of those actions or lack thereof fell outside of his official conduct as president of the United States. And it's for this reason that whether you like him or not, you cannot sue him for the actions that he has taken as president of the United States. Okay, so we're 0 for 2, no governments. But there has to be someone that we can sue and actually get to the merits of the case, right? Well, maybe. Some have argued that Fox News, as well as other cable news channels, have promoted incorrect information, misleading comments, and other conspiracy theories that have been detrimental to actually fighting the coronavirus pandemic.
As the Surgeon General said on Justice last week, you don't need a mask unless you're sick.
But the issue of suing Fox News or other cable news channels isn't exactly coming out of left field. And as a result, some have argued that Fox News ought to face some liability for the misinformation that they allegedly have circulated. And Fox News itself appears to be concerned that they may be subject to a potential lawsuit from viewers for their misleading reporting of the coronavirus. In fact, just recently, Fox Business Network parted ways with Trish Regan just a few days after she made the bold declaration that the coronavirus was, quote, another attempt to impeach the president.
And like with the Mueller investigation, like with Ukraine Gate, they don't care who they hurt.
So if indeed their reporting is misleading or false, and with a bunch of viewers that showed up a little late to the game having relied on the message pushed by Fox News, could these viewers have a cause of action against Fox News for injuries that they suffered as a result of the coronavirus? Well, the initial answer is that they could probably file suit, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the suit would be successful, probably quite the opposite. In theory, an individual could bring a civil lawsuit against Fox News for committing an act or omission that gave rise to an injury or harm for which the courts could impose liability, commonly known as a tort. The argument would most likely be that they breached a duty to the plaintiffs in presenting them with false or misleading information, and that as a result of which the plaintiffs suffered significant damages. Now, we don't have time to get into the nuance of every aspect of tort law and civil litigation, but most likely a claim of this nature could be made by a plaintiff on the grounds of something like public nuisance or maybe some form of negligent misrepresentation. In a suit for public nuisance, a plaintiff can recover for activities that hurt a neighborhood or society as a whole. But to be liable for public nuisance, it must be proven that the defendant interfered with public property or a right that is common to the public. But usually that's reserved for creating a public health hazard. Another argument can be made for suing Fox News under a negligent misrepresentation theory, although that's typically seen in contract actions or quasi-contract actions where the main premise of the misrepresentation has to do with a person's failure to exercise a reasonable duty of care, which in turn causes another person to be injured in some manner. Basically, someone says something that's false, they either knew it was false at the time, or they should have known it was false at the time, and as a result, another person detrimentally relies on that and incurs damages. But Fox News doesn't have a contractual relationship with its viewers and doesn't really have an obligation to do anything on behalf of its viewers, including telling them the truth. Some states have consumer protection statutes that might apply. For example, a consumer watchdog group called Washlight in Washington state filed a suit against Fox News claiming its news coverage violated consumer protection statutes. That particular suit also alleged that Fox committed the tort of outrage, which isn't really a thing. Sometimes that's a synonym for intentional infliction of emotional distress, but that definitely doesn't apply here. So the first suit out of the gate suing Fox News is pretty much nonsense and is absolutely going to get dismissed very, very quickly. In general, throwing nonsensical claims into a complaint is not a good look, and that doesn't bode well for the success of your lawsuit. Now, despite having these plausible and some not so plausible legal grounds to file suit against Fox News, it's important to remember that the goal is not just to file a lawsuit, but actually to win and get damages. Now, beyond the initial hurdles such as proving that a plaintiff could establish justifiable reliance on information received from a partisan news source, Fox News will have many, many defenses in its arsenal to probably get all of these potential lawsuits dismissed pretty quickly. The first and strongest defense for Fox News is probably free speech under the First Amendment. You might not agree with Fox News's message, but they have a First Amendment right to say it, and they should. Now, the framework for the free speech defense starts with the seminal case from the 1960s called New York Times versus Sullivan, which held that the First Amendment's protections of free speech are not limited to just truthful statements because, quote, an erroneous statement is inevitable in free debate and must be protected if the freedoms of expression are to have the breathing space that they need to survive. Over the years, this holding has led to a fairly bulletproof defense for all sorts of tort actions, including those for product liability, defamation, including those involving media outlets. Now, I have covered the holding in New York Times versus Sullivan on this channel many times in the past. I'll probably do it again because it is always relevant. But the idea is that we shouldn't punish misleading or false speech in most cases. We should simply fight it with more accurate speech. And we generally don't want the government making decisions as to what speech is true and what speech is false.
They are the fake, disgusting news.
That's a dangerous road to go down. Another defense would be the lack of proximate causation. Fox News would probably argue that any plaintiff would be unable to show that whatever the misleading statements from Fox News was the actual proximate act that led to their contracting of the coronavirus or the economic downturn, that there are lots of different factors going on at any given time and that it's unlikely that Fox News contributed in the last instance to the damages suffered. And another defense is that Fox News would simply argue that they don't have a duty to any of their viewers, that there's not a special relationship that gives rise to any special duty. If you are walking by a pool and you see someone drowning, generally speaking, unless you push them into the pool, you don't have a duty to pull them out. Now, the no duty rule, which has its origin in cases involving property owners, generally holds that a defendant owes no duty of care to warn, protect, or insure against risks that are common, frequent, or expected. And since Fox News doesn't have any particular special relationship with any of its viewers, it doesn't owe a duty and therefore can't be held liable for any kind of negligent acts. This is generally what we call a slap suit, or in other words, a strategic lawsuit against public participation. And if you didn't like Bob Murray suing John Oliver, which I did a video about, then you really shouldn't be in favor of people trying to stifle news organizations or politicians for exercising their free speech. We might not like what they have to say, but they should be allowed to say it. So yeah, this is America. If you can dream up a successful lawsuit, then odds are there will be an attorney that will file it for you.
Can you imagine a world without lawyers? Oh.
But just because you can file a lawsuit doesn't mean that you should. And it's an unfortunate reality that so many people are suffering under the circumstances, but the answer is not always a lawsuit. It's hard for me to say that as an attorney, but it is not always the case that the best thing to do is to sue people or to even be able to sue certain people. There are good reasons why we have some of these legal defenses in place. Now, I know you think you'd make the world a better place by suing these people into oblivion, but really you'd be doing more harm than good because we don't want lawsuits that stifle speech. But if you do really want to do some good for this world, try Tab for a Cause, which lets you raise money for charity just by opening up new tabs and browsing the internet, which you were probably going to do anyway. Tab for a Cause is a Google Chrome extension that allows you to pick the charity of your choice, and then every time you open up a new tab, instead of a blank page, it displays a beautiful new customizable tab with a couple of tiny ads. The money that you generate is then donated to your charity. You see in real time how much money is being generated. And it's gamified so that every time you open up a tab, you create a heart, which you can then donate to the charity of your choice. Tab for a Cause is partnered with several COVID-19 specific charities too, so you can fight the effects of coronavirus directly from your couch. The gorgeous new tab that you open up is really helpful too. You can customize it with graphics. I like to see pictures of the outdoors to remember what the outdoors look like. Anyone remember the outdoors? It was really great, wasn't it? And then it lets you customize things like bookmarks, create to-do lists, and even write yourself notes, which I find really helpful to have in a new tab every time I open it up. And once you've opened up a tab or two, you can then choose the actual charity that you want the money to go to. There's absolutely no charge to you, and it makes a positive difference in this world. All you have to do is click the link in the description and install the Google Chrome extension. Tab for a Cause users like you have raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for charity. It has got to be the easiest possible way to donate to charity. You could even just sit there and open up a bunch of tabs for fun. So just click on the link in the description to download the extension and do some good by doing what you were going to do anyway.